Hi guys. So Boris Johnson was called in front of a committee, a select committee, to respond to questions about the pandemic, Brexit, and testing. Now, he was asked a specific question here about how a second lockdown, would it be a problem for the UK economy? And his answer is quite interesting. So let's hear the question and then finally his answer.
Okay. Now, in terms of national debt right now, I'm just going to final question. We're currently at levels not seen since 1961, when we were still paying off the war. In all honesty, Prime Minister, can this country afford a second national lockdown?
I don't want a second national lockdown, Julian. I think it would be completely wrong for this country.
Can we afford it, Prime Minister?
And we are going to do everything in our power to prevent it. And can we afford it? I very much doubt that the financial consequences would be anything but disastrous. But we have to make sure that we defeat the disease by the means that we've set out. And so when I see the people saying, arguing against the rule of six, or saying that the government is coming in too hard on individual liberties and so on, I totally understand that. I sympathise with that. But we must beat this disease.
Okay, so I want to answer the second part first, and then I'll go to the main point. The second part first, what is he doing here? He's blaming the public. So if we have to have a second lockdown, it's your fault. You're complaining about the rule of six, you're complaining about the measures we're putting in place. It's your fault. So just to leave that first, park that for a moment. So the main point here is about this disastrous lockdown. So if the UK were to go into a second lockdown, it would be disastrous financially for the country. Now, what's the possibility of actually going into a second lockdown? Well, here's an article from The Guardian. It says, this is from Monday, the 14th of September. It says, 86% of doctors in England expect second wave within 6 months. BMA surveys also found 90% thought test and trace failures were a risk factor. So let's just put that into perspective. So Boris Johnson is saying that he wants to avoid a second lockdown. Doctors are saying it's highly likely that there's going to be a second wave. We're seeing cases increase all the time. At the beginning of this committee meeting, I leave a link to the full video in the video description, so you can watch all of it. I do recommend watching all of it. But at the beginning, Boris Johnson talked about how there were new cases. It's necessary to test more because there are new cases. But what the big problem here is that if there is a second wave, it's highly likely there will be a second lockdown. Now, the government can try to avoid a lockdown by imposing local lockdowns or increasing some restrictions. But we've seen, for example, today on Wednesday in Israel, that they are imposing another lockdown for a short period, but it isn't a second lockdown in Israel. The UK can try and avoid this, but what will happen is, as the weather gets colder, as we get closer to winter, more and more people are going to be forced together, maybe in workplaces or in the home. And as people get closer together, stay indoors, this is going to facilitate the spread of the pandemic. People are not going to be able to maintain social distancing. So we're going to see more and more cases. Now, you have to remember that as cases increase, there is a lag of about at least 2 weeks before you start to see numbers of deaths from those cases. Now, I'm hoping that this is not the case, that the number of deaths remain as low as possible, but it is highly likely that as new cases increase dramatically, the government will have to impose either greater restrictions, local lockdowns, or maybe a national lockdown once again. Now, Boris Johnson may give the impression that he's in control of this. He's not. We've seen how the test and trace has been a disaster. I am going to upload a video about how the UK has been asking countries like Germany and Italy to help them process testing samples. So it means that the UK is not capable of doing it on their own. They haven't been prepared for this. The Tories undermined the NHS for 10 years. And then when it was necessary to start using medical equipment like PPE, they had to eat into the Brexit stockpile. And finally, the biggest problem here as well. So it's highly likely that there's going to be a second lockdown because the cases are increasing. But what happens on the 1st of January? Brexit. Boris Johnson had the opportunity. He was given the opportunity by the European Union. He was begged by people in Parliament, members of the public, please ask for an extension to the transition period so we can deal with this pandemic. And his response was, no, we're not going to extend the transition period. We don't have to. And that was in the middle of the pandemic. Now, I think his thinking at the time was, we'll get over this, we'll get back to normal, and then we can drive forward with Brexit. But now what we're seeing is, what's highly likely is a second wave, maybe a lockdown, and the economic damage that's going to cause is going to be doubled, perhaps, with Brexit. Now, I imagine what Boris Johnson is hoping for, and maybe I'm being less than generous here when I say this, but I think Boris Johnson is hoping that he doesn't have to impose a lockdown until after Brexit, after the 1st of January. Because in that case, what he can say is he can blame any economic damage, any stress, any civil unrest on the lockdown itself. So when Brexit starts to bite, when people start to realize, wait a minute, this is a disaster, I didn't vote for this, Boris Johnson can impose his lockdown and then blame the problems of Brexit on the lockdown. It's a tactic. The Tories don't think long term, so they will probably use this tactic in order to cover, to protect the party and cover Boris Johnson's arse. So let's just remember that Boris Johnson had an opportunity to extend the transition period, to give the UK breathing space to deal with this pandemic, to put in place the measures necessary, to take Brexit off the table for a period of time. It wasn't going away. It was just parking it for a bit in order to deal with the pandemic. And Boris Johnson said no. He was afraid of the Brexiteers. He was afraid to challenge them, to stand up and do the right thing. It would have been, and I said it at the time, it would be the right thing to park Brexit for a moment, extend the transition period, deal with the pandemic, and then get back to Brexit when the dust had settled. But unfortunately, Boris Johnson is only looking out for Boris Johnson, and he's using whatever tactics he can to protect his position, which is frankly disgusting. Let me know in the comment section, guys, what you think. As always, your comments are greatly appreciated. Thanks a lot. I want to say a big thank you to all of my patrons. You ensure that this channel continues to exist. I'm eternally grateful for all of your support. If you join Patreon, you will receive instant access to our Discord server, where we have both audio and video chats. You can chat with me and other patrons, where we discuss important and non-important issues. Becoming a patron per month costs about the same as a large coffee, so why not check it out?